She stood up in front of everyone at that dinner table. Her husband's colleagues, his boss, people I'd never met in my life. And she introduced me as Dad's old neighbor who came to visit. Not her father. Not the man who drove 4 hours in a January snowstorm to be there. Her old neighbor. I sat there with my fork in my hand, and I didn't say a word. I just smiled, the way you do when something hits you so hard you go quiet instead of loud. My son-in-law shook my hand and said, "Nice to meet you." And I said, "You too." And that was that. Nobody corrected her. Not even my daughter. I drove back to Sudbury that same night. Told her I had an early morning. She texted me halfway through the drive, "Thanks for coming, Dad. Sorry it was short." I didn't reply until I'd pulled into my driveway and sat in the dark for a while. Then I typed back, "No problem. Drive safe." And I put the phone face down on the passenger seat and went inside. That was 8 months before everything changed. Let me go back a bit, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. My name is Thomas Beaumont. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a land surveyor for the province of Ontario, mostly up north, Sudbury, Timmins, a stretch near Cochrane that most people couldn't find on a map without squinting. My wife Diane and I raised our daughter Jenna in a small bungalow on Lakeshore Drive. Nothing fancy. A decent backyard, a garage that always needed work, a kitchen that smelled like coffee, and whatever Diane was baking on Sunday mornings. It was a good life, a real one. Diane passed 6 years ago. Breast cancer. She fought it for 2 years, and she fought it quietly, the way she did everything, without making a fuss, without asking for more than she needed. I held her hand on a Tuesday morning in November, and she was gone by noon. The house went very still after that. It stayed still for a long time. Jenna was 26 when her mother died. She'd already moved to Toronto by then, working in marketing for some firm downtown. We talked on the phone every Sunday, same as always. She came home for Christmas. Things were fine between us. At least, I thought they were. You don't always know what someone is burying until they stop having a reason to hide it. She met her husband, I'll call him Marcus because that's his name, about a year after Diane passed. He came from money, old money, the kind that doesn't need to mention itself because it's already in the room. His family had a place in Rosedale, a cottage in Muskoka, the right last name for the right circles. He wasn't a bad man. I want to be fair about that. He wasn't cruel or loud or dishonest. He was just from a different world, and Jenna had decided she wanted to live in that world, and somewhere along the way I had become a reminder of the one she'd left. I noticed it gradually. The way she stopped mentioning where she grew up around his friends. The way she'd refer to her mother as my mom instead of mom. A small thing, maybe, but Diane never would have stood for being called Mum. The way she laughed a little too quickly when someone made a joke about Northern Ontario, like she was trying to get ahead of it before it landed on her. I told myself it was just her finding her footing in a new life. People adapt. People grow. I'd done it myself, moving from a small town to Sudbury at 22. I understood wanting more than what you started with. But then came the dinner. Marcus had been promoted. Head of operations for some commercial real estate company. I didn't fully understand it, but it was significant. They threw a small dinner at their condo in Yorkville. 12 people around a long table, linen napkins, wine I couldn't pronounce. I wore my good blazer, the one Diane helped me pick out for her brother's retirement party back in 2015. I thought I looked fine. I was the first one there. Jenna answered the door and hugged me. But there was something clipped about it, the kind of hug you give when you're in the middle of doing something else. She handed me a glass of white wine and said the others would be arriving soon. They arrived in pairs mostly. Suits and blazers and dresses that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Confident voices, easy laughter. I sat at the end of the table near a man named, I think, Elliot, who worked in finance and his wife who asked me what I did, and nodded slowly when I said I'd been a land surveyor. Then Marcus's director arrived, an older man, very polished, the kind of person who makes you feel slightly underdressed just by walking in. He went around the table introducing himself. When he got to me, he looked at Jenna, and she said, and I remember this word for word because it embedded itself in me like a splinter, "This is Thomas. He's an old family friend from up north. He used to live near my parents. I am her parent. I am the only parent she has left." The director shook my hand. "Wonderful," he said. "Always good to have familiar faces at these things." I agreed. I smiled. I cut my food into smaller pieces and ate and listened to conversations about commercial leases and Calgary markets and a ski trip to Whistler. I drank 2 glasses of wine and excused myself before dessert. She followed me to the hallway. "You okay, Dad?" "Just tired," I said. "Long drive. You should have taken the train. Maybe next time." She kissed my cheek. I put on my coat. I drove home in the dark, and I didn't cry until I hit the 400 north of Barrie, and then I cried for about 10 minutes, and then I stopped and turned on the radio and drove the rest of the way in silence. I didn't say anything to her about it. Not that night, not in the weeks after. I wasn't sure what I would have said. You erased me from the table like a watermark. I kept turning it over, the way you do with something that doesn't sit right, and I kept landing in the same place. She was ashamed of me. Not of anything I'd done, just of what I was, where I came from, what my hands looked like and what my blazer cost, and the fact that I drove a 20-Ford F-150 and lived in a bungalow in Sudbury with a garage that still needed work. I thought about what Diane would have said. She had a way of cutting to the center of things, without drama. She would have said, "Thomas, don't let her decide who you are. You already know." And she would have been right, the way she was usually right about things that mattered. 3 months after the dinner, I got a letter from a law office in Ottawa. I had an uncle, my father's younger brother, a man named Gerald Whitmore, which means nothing to you, but to me meant a birthday card every year until I was 12 and a handshake at my father's funeral in 1999. He was a quiet man, never married, no children. He'd spent his career in the federal civil service, lived in a small apartment in the Glebe, seemed to want very little. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 15 years. I'd sent him a Christmas card when Diane died, out of habit more than expectation, and never heard back. He had died in February. The letter from the law office informed me that I was the sole beneficiary of his estate. I sat at my kitchen table and read the letter 3 times. Then I called the number at the bottom and spoke to a woman named Petra, the solicitor handling the estate, who explained very calmly and clearly that my uncle had accumulated a significant amount over his lifetime through a combination of his pension, decades of careful investment, and the sale of a property in the Glebe that had appreciated considerably. He had no debts. He had no dependents. He had named me specifically by name and relationship in a handwritten note attached to the will. The note said, "He never forgot where he came from. Neither did his father. I hope he passes that on." The estate totaled just over $900,000. I said, "I'm sorry, can you say that again?" And she said it again, and I wrote it down on the back of the envelope and looked at it for a long time after I hung up. I want to be clear about what I did first. I didn't call Jenna. I didn't call anyone. I put on my coat and I drove out to Ramsey Lake and I sat on the bench where Diane and I used to walk on Sunday mornings, and I said to her out loud, because there was no one around, "I think we're going to be okay." And then I sat there until my ears got cold, and then I drove back home and I called Petra and told her to proceed. I moved carefully over the next few months. I paid off the remaining mortgage on the house. Not much left, but enough to matter. I had the garage properly insulated finally. I had the kitchen renovated, not fancily, just the way Diane always wanted it. New countertops, better lighting, a proper backsplash. I started a TFSA and put a significant portion into it, got proper financial advice from an advisor in town who I'd known for years. I bought myself a newer truck. Not extravagant, a 2023 Ford F-150 in dark green. I liked the color. I did not tell Jenna. This was not a decision I made dramatically. I didn't sit there rubbing my hands together. I simply noticed when I imagined calling her that I didn't want to. Not yet. Maybe not at all. What I wanted was to sit with this quietly for a while. This thing my uncle had given me, this acknowledgement that someone in my family had seen me clearly, had trusted me, had said, "You're the one." I wanted to hold it before anyone else's hands got on it. She called me in April like she usually did. Her calls had gone from weekly to every few weeks to roughly once a month since the wedding, and I'd long since stopped counting. She sounded distracted. Marcus had a big deal closing in Vancouver. They were thinking about a vacation. Tulum, maybe. She asked how I was doing. "Good," I said. "Kitchen's looking nice. You renovated?" "A bit, nothing major." "Oh," a small pause. "How'd you afford that on the pension?" And there it was, said lightly, almost absently, the way you say something you've been thinking but haven't meant to say out loud. She recovered quickly, started talking about something else. I let her. But that sentence settled into the same place as the dinner, and it sat there. The summer passed. I did something I hadn't done in years. I took a trip. Just me. I drove out to Cape Breton, took my time, stopped at places I'd been meaning to see for decades. Spent a week in a cabin near Badek. Read 4 books, hiked the Cabot Trail twice. Ate fresh lobster in a little place in Cheticamp, and thought about how I'd never done this when Diane was alive because we were always saving up, always putting something aside for later. I made a quiet promise to her that I'd keep going, that there would be a lot more later. I got back in August. There was a voicemail from Jenna that I'd missed while I was out of range near Ingonish. Her voice sounded different, smaller. "Dad, it's me. Call me when you get a chance. It's not urgent. It's just, can you call me?" I sat on my porch and called her back. She and Marcus were having problems. Real problems. Not the kind you can paper over with a vacation. She wasn't going into details on the phone, she said, but she might need to come home for a little while. Could she come home? I said yes. Of course. Your room's still yours. She drove up 2 weeks later. I made dinner. I didn't make it into a production. Just roast chicken, roasted potatoes, green beans, the way her mother used to do them with a bit of butter and lemon. She came in the door and stopped and looked at the kitchen. "When did you do all this?" "Earlier in the year. Dad." She ran her hand along the countertop. "This is really nice. Diane always wanted it like this." She set her bag down and started to cry, which surprised us both. I handed her a tea towel because it was the closest thing, and she laughed through the tears. Which was exactly something her mother would have done, and I thought, there she is. There was the girl I raised. We ate dinner and she talked, and I mostly listened. Things with Marcus had grown cold in ways that had been coming for a long time. He wasn't unkind, but he was absent. He was building something, and she was meant to fit into the shape of it. And she'd been fitting for 3 years, and something had finally slipped. She was 32 years old, and she was tired. I didn't offer advice. I handed her more potatoes. I said, "You'll figure it out," and meant it. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Dad, I have to tell you something." I waited. That dinner, at our place, when I introduced you as, I said you were a family friend. She looked at the table. "I knew you heard. I knew it landed wrong. I've been carrying that since November, and I didn't know how to bring it up." I said, "Tell me why you did it." She took a long time. "Because I was scared they'd look at you and think less of me. And I know how that sounds. It sounds honest, I said. I'm not proud of it. I know. You're my father, she said. You're the only person in my life who has never once needed me to be something I wasn't. And I introduced you as a neighbor. I looked at her. Your mother would have had something to say about that. She laughed, a little waterlogged. I know exactly what she would have said. So do I. We sat with that for a moment. Then I got up and cleared the plates and put the kettle on. And when I came back to the table, I said, "There's something I should tell you." I told her about the letter, the solicitor, the estate. I told her what the number was, and I watched her face go through about 4 expressions in 3 seconds. She said, "Dad, why didn't you tell me? I needed to sit with it first. For 8 months, more or less." She stared at me. "What have you done with it?" "Fixed the kitchen. Went to Cape Breton. Paid off the house. But the rest somewhere sensible." I paused. "I also bought a new truck." She looked out the window at the driveway. "The green one. The green one." She was quiet for a moment. "And you didn't tell me, because I wasn't sure what you would have needed from me," I said, "and I wanted to know what I needed first." She nodded slowly. She understood that. I could see her turning it over, understanding it in a way she might not have a year ago. "I'm not going to pretend I wouldn't have come up here sooner," she said finally. "I know," I said, "and I'm not saying you were wrong to wait. I know that too." The kettle clicked. I poured the tea. Outside, the lake was doing that late August thing where the light goes gold and long and everything looks slightly more itself than usual. Diane used to love that light. She used to make me stop whatever I was doing and just look at it for a minute. Jenna stayed for almost 3 weeks. She helped me clear out the last of her mother's things from the hall closet, a task I'd been avoiding for 6 years. We found Diane's old recipes in a shoebox, handwritten on index cards in her neat, looping script. Jenna took photos of every single one on her phone. She sat at the kitchen table and read them one by one and cried a little and laughed a little, and I sat across from her and drank my coffee and let her have it. On the last night before she drove back, she said, "I told Marcus I needed some time." I nodded. "I don't know what's going to happen." "You don't have to know yet." "I was trying to become someone," she said, "and I think I accidentally became someone I don't like very much." I thought about that. "You know what my uncle, wrote in that note?" She shook her head. "He said he never forgot where he came from." I looked at her. "That's all he said. That was enough to leave $900,000 on." She sat with that for a long time. In the morning she hugged me on the porch, a real one, the kind that doesn't rush itself, and got in her car and drove south. I stood there until the car was out of sight, which is something my father used to do, and his father before him, and I hadn't done since Diane died. I went back inside. The kitchen was exactly as Diane had always wanted it. The light came in through the new window at the right angle. I put the kettle on and sat down at the table with a clean cup. I didn't know what would happen with Jenna and Marcus. I didn't know if she'd find her way back to herself, or find a different self entirely, or something in between. I didn't know what I'd do with the rest of the money, or the rest of the years, or the long winters up here that have a way of asking you who you are when there's no one around to perform for. But I knew what I was. I knew where I came from. And I knew that an old man I barely remembered had looked at me from a distance and decided that was worth something. That was enough to start with.